Welcome to Malicious and Mysterious. I am Braylee Parkinson, a mystery writer who loves sharing malicious and or mysterious stories. Today we are going to talk about the Hex Murders. Many of you may have heard of the Nelson Rehmeyer murder that took place in 1928 because there was a documentary called Hex Hollow that came out in 2015. But have you heard of the Hex murder that took place in 1934? I hadn't until I came across a newspaper article that I found about the cold blooded murder of Susan Mummy. Hopefully, that's pronounced correctly. Today, we are going to talk about both the Mummy murder and the Rehmeyer murder and their connection to a larger phenomenon of murders where killers use the excuse of a hex for the crimes that they committed. The strangest part about this defense is that it partially worked in both of these cases. Stories take place in the state of Pennsylvania. But before we dig in, we need to go back a little bit and talk about this section of Pennsylvania. So, in the 1800s, a lot of German immigrants moved to Pennsylvania to escape religious persecution. Amish, Mennonite, and Brethren, and other groups went to Pennsylvania looking for religious freedom, a state which is known to have a history of respecting people's religion. A group of brothers with the last name of Rehmeyer left Germany and purchased 96 acres of land near York, Pennsylvania. This area would eventually come to be known as Rehmeyer Hollow. But before we dig in too far, we need to go back to 1820 when a man named Johann George Hoffmann published a book called Long Lost Friend. The book contains incantations and spells that can be used to help both humans and animals. Practitioners of the spells and incantations in this book were called powwowers. So, powwow practitioners align themselves with religious beliefs more than science. A lot of the things in Long Lost Friend are just old things that people would do long before doctors were popular or common or easy to access, that they would use to try to heal animals or humans who were having some type of illness or problem. But there also are some things in there that you might use if you think somebody has put a curse on you or some other issue that's more metaphysical than physical. So, this is a book that it's not like a secret or anything. It was commonly known, and the idea is that the powwow practitioner, they would heal people, but they were a conduit through which God worked. And the preface to the book says, quote, "Call upon me in the day of trouble, I will deliver thee, and thou shalt glorify me," end quote. And that comes from Psalms in the Bible. Hoffman inserts his Bible verse, perhaps to explain that he is basing his ideas of powwowing on something God would approve of. So now that we have that historical background, let's move to the 1920s. At this point, the United States is seeing a big industrial boom. But a lot of Pennsylvania was still pretty rural, and I mean, even today is. Agriculture was a huge profession there. And while there was a technology boom and things like that going on, because a lot of people around York County were still living in pretty rural situations, it was a lot easier for you to go to a powwow practitioner for medical care or for advice about your animals or something like that than it was for you to go and find a doctor. This is not uncommon. Throughout history, people have turned to individuals in their community who they think may be blessed with certain powers or something like that, or just even extra knowledge. There's a book called The Trotula. This kind of reminds me of it. Basically, The Trotula is a medieval book that treated women's diseases and conditions, and it just had all these different remedies in it that people would use depending on what was going on. And so Long Lost Friend is similar to that, but I think that the Long Lost Friend gets more into some of the metaphysical stuff as well. And that might make it a little bit different from the tarantula, although there were some things in there. I read that back in grad school. There were some things in there that, you might use if you wanted to attract a certain man or something like this. So I guess that you could say that it also has like little spells or something like that in there. So Nelson Raymeyer was a powwow practitioner who was known around town as a man who was always ready to help others. He helped others so much that his wife, tired of all the people that came to their house for assistance, moved to another house for privacy. So Nelson was a big, strong man who kept to himself. He tended his animals and his crops in the hollow. He was very successful farming. He had a socialist slant politically, so some people weren't really on board with that. But according to his extended family members, who were, some of them were, they knew him. They're older, but they knew him. They were children, obviously, back in the 1920s. In the documentary, the Hex Hollow documentary, they say that he wasn't a recluse like a lot of the accounts paint him out to be. He worked his farm and he kept himself, yes, but he was clearly engaged with his community because there were constantly people coming to his house for assistance. So it's clear that he was at least popular and well known, regardless of what some accounts of this case claim. Sadly, a lot of the information that I read through or listened to for this episode, it painted Raymeyer as like someone who was mean and, people didn't like him and things like that. But it just doesn't jive with the idea that he was a powwow practitioner and helping so many people that his wife was like, oh, too much company and left. So it just doesn't quite jive there. So I don't believe that those accounts are accurate. And I wonder if maybe they're painting it that way because they want to make this story some type of spooky kind of tale, when actually what's happening is that you have some people who have fallen on hard luck and they're looking for somebody to blame. It's not really that scary, which, by the way, I watched Apprentice to Murder. I do not recommend that movie. But they definitely painted Raymeyer out to be this like kind of weird guy who literally breathes fire. Just it was really crazy. Anyway, so there was a man named John Blymer, and he was right around Nelson Raymeyer's age. He was a little bit older, a year or so, and his life was much different from Raymeyer's. So John, at a very young age, was told that, his IQ was in the lower end of average intelligence and he had trouble making friends at school. He was surrounded by a family of powwowers. Like, this was something that was really common in his family. And basically, from what I've read, a powwower, what they'll do is they'll pass down the powwowing to the next generation. You're supposed to like train the opposite sex, from what I read. Like, if your father is a powwower, then he would train a daughter, and then the daughter would train, a male cousin or her son or whatever. Like, it passes through like that, which is actually kind of cool if you think about it. It's not like reserving power for one gender, so it's kind of cool. But anyway, John, he drops out of school and he takes a job. And he's basically just, kind of living this unremarkable life. But then one day, legend has it, he was leaving work and a rabid dog came up to him. So John was able to heal the dog and the creature went on its way. So this is a turning point. It seems like John, who hasn't had many things in life that he's done well, is able to powwow. So John, since he has a knowledge of powwowing, this is his thing. This is a power that he has. And he feels like he's received his calling. So John goes through life. He ends up getting married. Sadly, he loses his two children. They die as toddlers, I believe. And he finds himself in an insane asylum after that. He doesn't stay there that long. He actually doesn't escape. He just literally walks out of the asylum and heads home. After that, John drifts around town. He's not a remarkable man, basically. And He's wondering why his life is going this way. And on top of all of the things that have happened to him, it seems like his powwowing skills have waned as well. He decides to seek out some information from a fellow powwower named Emily Knapp. Well, he goes to see her and she tells him, okay, take this dollar bill, hold it in your palm, cover it with your hand. She does a little spell or something. And when he removes his hand, he's supposed to see the person who has hexed him. Well, John sees Nelson Raymeyer's face. So there's no other explanation in this case as to why John would think that Raymeyer would hex him. It's just this lady who was known as the Witch of Marietta told him that Nelson Raymeyer had put a spell on him. In order to break the spell, John would need to get a lock of Nelson Raymeyer's hair and also Nelson Raymeyer's copy of Long Lost Friend. Once he had them, he would need to bury both items. Now, John Blymer wasn't the only person who was struggling at the time. A 14-year-old boy named John Curry, who I'll refer to as Curry going forward so that we don't get confused because there's another John. This young man, Curry, worked with John Blymer at the tobacco factory. At the time, he was living with his mother and a terrible stepfather who was abusive and mean to him and things like that. So obviously not a good life for a young boy. So Blymer had powwowed Curry back to health at one point. So obviously there's some loyalty there. So when Blymer tells him that Nelson Raymeyer has hexed him, Curry believes him. The third man in the equation is Wilbur Hess. He is a farm boy who is living in a family that isn't doing well. Like I said, this is a very, agricultural heavy area, and anyone who has done any type of farming or even gardening, you know that this is tough stuff. And sometimes you can have the best laid plans and your crops just don't come up. It just doesn't work out. So this farm, the Hess farm, was struggling, and they also had some disagreements with some of their extended family. And Wilbur, he hears about the curse from his father. And Wilbur's mother tells him that, oh my gosh, we need to break the curse. Like I mentioned, it's an excuse. If life is not going well for you, this whole, oh, someone hexed me excuse is great because you don't have to take any responsibility. It's literally just out of your control. It's not your fault. So that's basically what's happening here. So on November 26th, right around Thanksgiving, Wilbur Hess's brother drives Blymer and Curry to town. After that, they walk over to Mrs. Raymeyer's house, and she tells them, Nelson's down at the other house. Because remember, Mrs. Raymeyer and her girls, they moved to another house because Nelson is constantly powwowing and it's just too much. So Blymer and Curry head down to Nelson's house, and he lets them in. He actually serves them up a drink. They talk about powwowing and farming. And Nelson Raymeyer offers them a room to sleep in. He's like, hey, stay the night, So as you can see, this is quite a lot of hospitality for someone who is portrayed in a lot of accounts as being this kind of really mean guy. So Blymer and Curry, they take him up on the invitation. So they stay at Nelson's house. And then they get up in the morning and they say, goodbye. And then they head back to town. Now, the reason that they do this is because Blymer, he realizes that Nelson Raymeyer is big and strong. Like, he's a farmer. They're not going to be able to take him. So they need one more person. That's when they go back to the Hess house. And Wilbur's mother is like, hey, you can take the day off if you're going to end this curse, go for it. Okay, so on November 27th, Curry, Blymer, and Hess show up at Nelson's place late at night. Nelson lets him in, of course, because as we have seen from the previous day, Nelson he's hospitable. So he lets him in, and they demand the Long Lost Friend book from Nelson and a lock of his hair. Of course, he's like, what? You want what? They grab Nelson when he turns to put wood in the stove. The three assailants attack him, hitting him over the head so hard that his skull is fractured and fragments push into his brain. The three determine that Nelson is dead, and Blymer decides that a house fire would take care of all the evidence and it would burn the long lost friend book. They set the house on fire and they claim as they're leaving that Nelson is moving around in the flames when they look back. Whatever happened, the house did not burn. So a neighbor noticed that the animals on Nelson's property were restless the next day. So he fed them and, just thought, oh, I don't know what Nelson's doing. I'm just going to feed him. So then the next day, the neighbor heads over. He grabs another neighbor and they go to Nelson's house, and that's when they find him dead. So Nelson was on top of the floor joist, but there was a potato bin there. And according to his great grandson, the fire was smothered by the fluids of Nelson's body, and that's why Nelson didn't burn, and it's also why the house didn't burn. So this explanation tells us that it wasn't something supernatural or anything like that. It was just that where they killed Nelson and tried to, set him on fire, it didn't work out because there is a potato bin right under there. People were shocked and saddened by the death of the popular powwow practitioner. Nelson's funeral was on December 5th at Sadler's Church, and it was packed. People stood outside because they couldn't fit in the church. And this is December in Pennsylvania, so I'm sure it was probably, pretty cold. Now, Mrs. Raymeyer told the police that Curry and Blymer had stopped by her house the night before Nelson was killed. Blymer actually admits to the police that he killed Nelson over a hex. The three murderers seemed to think that the hex was worth killing someone for. There was no remorse at the time from any of them. So the idea that witchcraft was the cause of the murder was something the newspapers jumped on. This built a good defense for insanity, but Blymer was convicted of first-degree murder, and the jury recommended a life sentence. Curry, who was still just a boy, was viewed as a neglected young man by the judge. Judge Walter Van Bayman didn't care about witchcraft or powwowing, but he saw the boy as a victim in the case. The judge blamed Curry's mother in the trial, and according to the Hex Hollow documentary, Curry's mother fainted when the judge blamed her for her son's involvement in Nelson Raymeyer's death. Harry Gross was Wilbur Hess's lawyer. He was the only lawyer of the three that was not working pro bono. Gross was retained, and he put forth the notion that Hess participated in the murder of Nelson Raymeyer as like a sacrificial lamb for his family. Basically, the lawyer compared Mrs. Hess, who told her son to go, you got to go break the curse, to Abraham from Genesis, when Abraham is told to take Jacob up and sacrifice him. Somehow this worked in the case. This argument that, it really wasn't Hess's fault or something like that. So he ends up getting convicted of second-degree murder, and he's given 10 years in prison. In the Hex Hollow documentary, they talked to John Blymer's nephew. He said he never had full contact with John, but he says his dad told him that after John got out of jail, John came to visit, and there was the thought that John had not changed, and if given the chance, he would go back and kill Raymeyer again, even after being released from jail. This was not the first time that John had been suspected of murder. In 1928, Gertrude Rudy was found dead on the railroad tracks. Now, this was a young woman that John had been seeing, and she allegedly was pregnant by John, and he wanted her gone, so he shot her and left on the train tracks, allegedly. At that time, John was married, so this would have been a bad thing for him to get another woman pregnant. The murder was never solved, and John was never charged, but some people suspected him as being the killer. Now, after prison, John moved to Philadelphia, and he worked as an apartment manager. He ended up buying the apartment complex, and he died in 1970 Two, he was 76, and no one from his family attended his funeral. Now, Curry, he was paroled after 10 years and he joined the army. He actually helped draft the maps used in the Normandy invasion in World War II, and he studied art after he retired from the army. He ended up getting married and he raised two daughters. People remember him fondly. And I mean, obviously, when Nelson Ray Meyer was killed, Curry was just a young man. He was a troubled boy who was following adults at the time who were doing bad things. But a lot of people, they had no idea that Curry was involved in the murder unless he told them. He lived out his short life in Thomasville and he passed away at 49. Hess served his entire term. He picked up skills while he was in prison and he moved back to York County. He got married, he had a few kids. He was an electroplater until he retired in 1970, and people remember him fondly as well. They said he was a hard worker who lived a quiet life, and he passed away at the age of 68. This is such an interesting story, and the Hex Hollow documentary, I think that it's really worth watching. I enjoyed the fact that they had people who knew the victim and also the murderers. It was, now obviously this happened a long time ago, but there are still some people out there that, had connections to them. And it was nice to hear what they thought about these people and how they interacted with them and how you never would have known that at least 2 out of the 3 had participated in this murder. I also like the fact that they found family members. That was really cool as well. In October 2013, Nelson Ray Meyer's house was open to the public for the first time. Of course, I want to go there and tour it at some point. But it was open so that people could learn about the history. And as I read about this case, initially it was portrayed as like this spooky kind of thing. But as I read it, I was like, this is not what it is. This murder is not about witchcraft or spells or anything like that. It's really about 3 people who were having a hard time and looking for someone to blame. Simple as that. So that is our first case. Now the second one, it's going to be a little bit shorter, but I thought that it would be interesting to include it because it's another murder that's based on a hex. So this takes us to Ringtown, Pennsylvania in 1934. So this is coal country, eastern Pennsylvania. Some call it hill country. And it's not a large bustling place. In fact, the town has never had over 1,000 people. So Susan Mummy was born in 1870. She married in her early 20s and had a child soon after that. And there's not a lot of information about her first husband or anything, or even her first child. But her second husband's death caused people to shun her. Now, this is interesting because this story, it doesn't, in my mind, lend to shunning. Susan's husband worked at DuPont. One day, she'd had a dream. She didn't want him to go to work. She said, I had a dream that you died in an explosion. Don't go to work. He brushed it off and he went to work and he ended up dying in an explosion. For some reason, this caused people to label Susan as a witch. Now, she probably did practice powwowing to some extent because a lot of people in this area would have during this time. But to have like a premonition that somebody's going to die and then they die, I mean, I think that that's something that happens more often than people admit. So there were quite a few people in the area that didn't like Susan. She was described by the Pottsville Republican newspaper as a colorful character. And one woman said that Susan, she was suspicious of people, but if you gained her confidence, quote, there never was a truer friend, end quote. The paper goes on to say that the case takes place in the, quote, hillbilly section of our county that is on par with the Kentucky backwoods, end quote. Susan had been involved in a court battle over land with a relative, and even though she lost the case, Susan had refused to leave. When she refused to leave the house, the sheriff in order to evict her, burned down the house. So this was obviously a pretty heated debate. And, yeah, it's pretty stubborn to not leave after you've lost the court battle and things like that. So I do understand why this might turn people off because it's like you lost legally, get out of the house. So the sheriff ends up burning down the house. There's not a ton of information about Susan, but at the time of her death, she was 63 and she was running like a little boarding house. Once again, this is a case where the victim is portrayed as almost getting what she deserved or being just a really bad person or whatever. But I want us to note that just like Nelson, at the time when Susan is killed, she is helping someone else. So the night of her murder, her and her daughter Trovelia and a boarder named Jacob Rice were at the house. Susan and her daughter, they were in the middle of helping the boarder, Jacob, with a boil that he had on his foot. And in the middle of that, bullets came through the window and pierced Susan's side. The bullets ripped through her lungs and heart, killing her. Jacob Rice, the boarder, eventually makes his way to the police to report the murder. The police investigation was short. Basically, a group of boys reported seeing a local jitney driver's car by the murder scene. When the police stopped by Albert Shinsky's house and asked why he'd been parked so near the crime scene, he told them that he had gone out there to kill Susan. He also said it was self-defense. Albert Shinsky claimed that Susan had hexed him 7 years prior when he worked on a farm next to her house. Albert said Susan came to a field one day and caught him with her eyes and hexed him. Albert went on to tell the police officers that he couldn't eat, sleep, or drink, and one day he met a girl that he was very interested in, but he wasn't able to show her how interested he was. Albert said that a black cat with green eyes would come into his room at night, and it grew to the size of the room. The giant cat would claw at him, and eventually Susan's face would appear on the cat's body. A spirit from the clouds came to Albert and told him that he had to shoot Susan with these homemade pumpkin ball bullets. Albert claimed that as soon as Susan was dead, he felt free. Initially, there was the threat of the death penalty in this case, but the local community rallied around Albert because they believed that Susan had cursed him, which is kind of infuriating. While Albert probably had a mental illness of some sort, it is disturbing that the community justified his actions because of an alleged curse. Albert was eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he was sent to the mental hospital, the same one that John Blymer had been in. Later on in life, Albert denounced his belief that Susan was a witch, and he said, "I was just an ignorant youth at the time I shot that poor woman." He was released from the mental hospital in the 1970s, 7 years before his death. There are several other murders that took place in the 1930s where the murderers tried to justify the crime by saying the victim hexed them. I read Tortured Minds, Pennsylvania's Most Bizarre but Forgotten Murders, which was full of crimes centered around hexes. It's an interesting read. I would recommend that book. But it is just a little disturbing that there were so many murders that were taking place in Pennsylvania that were blamed on hexes, and the fact that occasionally the community was supporting the murderers because they believed that the hexing was a valid reason for murder. So really disturbing stuff here, but interesting cases. And like I said, if you are interested in powwowing or these stories, I'd highly recommend the Hex Hollow documentary, and Tortured Minds was also a good book to read as well. That is all for now. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.